They beat an old woman not knowing her son was a U.S. Army general. Back off, old heck. The cop snarled, slamming her frail body against the burning hood. Alma didn't scream from pain, she screamed from rage. Her cane clattered to the pavement. Blood trickled down her temple. I didn't steal anything, she whispered, voice shaking. But they didn't care. One officer twisted her arm. The other laughed while snapping her cane in half like trash. You walk now, Grandma, he sneered. And the world? It just watched. But what they didn't know, what no one there knew, is that the call she made with shaking fingers would bring hell down on that street in less than 10 minutes. They didn't see Alma Jefferson as someone's mother. They didn't see her as a citizen. They didn't even see her as human. Just another old black woman on a hot afternoon, walking slow, probably in the way. And that walking was enough for them to stop her, push her, rip her purse off her shoulder, and accuse her of theft without a single question asked. Because to them, she looked like the kind of person who would. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where the stories we tell aren't fiction. They're reminders, warnings, and sometimes revenge dressed in truth. Subscribe now, because this one, you won't forget it. The year didn't matter. The neighborhood didn't matter. It could have been anywhere in America. It still is anywhere in America. Because even now, in a country built on the promise of liberty and justice for all, skin color can still dictate whether you're protected or punished. Alma was 77 years old. She walked with a cane. She had asthma and 3 prescriptions folded neatly in her bag. But none of that mattered to the 2 officers standing in the sun that day. All they saw was an easy target. No one important. No threat. No one that mattered enough to treat with decency. What they didn't see, that would cost them everything. See, that's the lie people like them keep telling themselves, that they can get away with it because no one's watching. That no one powerful ever comes for the poor. That if you beat someone who can't fight back, no one's coming to hold you accountable. But this time, they picked the wrong woman. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about power. About a system that still gives men the nerve to throw someone's grandmother face first into a car and laugh about it in public. About uniforms that make some people believe they're untouchable until the wrong name gets dialed. Until the call goes through. We've told ourselves stories about progress. About change. About how far we've come. But all it takes is one phone camera not recording fast enough, one neighbor too scared to speak up, one heartbeat where nobody steps in, and we're right back where we started. But not today. Today, that heartbeat came with a pulse strong enough to shake the ground. Let's go back. Back to the moment Alma Jefferson hit the pavement. Blood on her dress, fury in her chest, and a phone in her hand. The cane lay snapped on the concrete like a bone. Alma's cheek burned against the scalding hood, her breath shallow, chest pinned by the weight of a cop who didn't even flinch when she cried out. Get your hands off me, she managed through clenched teeth. The older officer grunted, pressing harder, his knuckles white as he forced her still. The younger one stood back, arms crossed, eyes dead. You think you can talk back to us? He asked, stepping closer, voice thick with contempt. You people always think someone owes you something. Alma didn't answer. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. She was 77, but the heat in her chest wasn't age. It was memory. It was history. She'd seen this before. Different uniforms. Same hatred. Her vision blurred. She reached for her chest, not from pain, but to feel the edge of fabric fold, the hidden pocket. The younger cop noticed. What are you grabbing at? He snapped, kicking her bag away. I said don't move. Alma ignored him. Her fingers found the outline of her phone. Her thumb swiped with muscle memory and desperation. No face ID. Just a number. One number. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then a voice. Steel. Sharp. Mama. She couldn't say much. Her jaw ached. Her head throbbed. They're hurting me, she whispered. That was all it took. Silence on the other end. Then the line went dead. She didn't need confirmation. She'd raised her boy to be a man who moved without needing more words. She tucked the phone back into her dress and let her hands fall limp. Let them think she was done. Let them think they'd won. Because now it wasn't just her on that street anymore. Minutes passed. The officers argued, distracted by a shirtless man running across traffic. Sirens wailed in the distance, but not for Alma. Not yet. Then came the sound. A growl. Not from an animal, but an engine. Big. Military. Tires screamed as a black unmarked vehicle took the corner sharp enough to kiss pavement. It stopped in front of the scene like a predator sizing up its prey. The doors opened in sync. No hesitation. 2 soldiers stepped out first, rifles slung but not aimed. The street fell silent. Even the heat seemed to pause. Then he stepped out. Boots black. Uniform sharp. Chest decorated. Face carved in calm rage. He didn't run. He didn't need to. His walk was command enough. The younger officer lowered his hand slowly. Confused. Uncertain. Sir, this is an active scene. The older one tried, lifting his chin in fake authority. The man didn't answer. A soldier handed him a secure radio. Report in progress, the soldier said. Coordinates locked. Channel secure. He raised it to his mouth. Confirmed assault on unarmed civilian, he said, voice flat and cold. 2 perpetrators. Both armed. Federal response, authorized. The soldier nodded. Response level, he asked. Priority 1, the man replied, cutting the line. Then he looked at Alma. She sat on the ground, legs twisted awkward, blood drying on her cheek. She looked up, eyes glassy. Bola, she whispered. That one word. That one name. And the general, Marcus Jefferson, his expression broke for the first time. Not with sadness. Not with pity. But something deeper. Reverence. He stepped past the cops like they weren't even there. When the corpulent officer moved to block him, Marcus didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply said, silence. The word froze the air. This woman, he continued, pointing to Alma, is 77. She walks with a cane. She has more courage in her body than both of you combined. And you beat her in public. You cracked her cane. You cracked her dignity. And now you will answer. The 2 soldiers stepped forward, silent as ghosts. On your knees. Place your weapons on the ground, Marcus ordered. The younger officer's lips trembled. The older one hesitated. Marcus didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The authority in his tone was heavier than the badges on their chest. One officer dropped his pistol. The other collapsed to his knees. And Alma, still sitting in the heat, didn't move. She just watched. Because finally, someone else was making them feel small. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence was louder than any command. The street had gone dead silent except for the hum of the vehicle still idling behind him. The 2 officers knelt in front of him, their posture sagging under the tension of the moment, trying to process how quickly they had lost control. The younger cop's mouth opened slightly, maybe to beg, maybe to explain, but no words came out. Alma sat still against the patrol car, her hands resting limply in her lap, her head turned just enough to watch her son without fully lifting it. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air. Everything about Marcus said retaliation was coming, not in fury, but with precision. He took a single step forward, standing over the older officer, whose badge still gleamed in the sun like it had minutes ago, back when he was laughing about broken canes and bruised wrists. What's your mother's name? Marcus asked calmly. The question hit with more force than a punch. The officer looked confused. What? Marcus didn't blink. I asked you. Her name. Your mother. The officer hesitated. Susan. Susan Rins. Marcus crouched down, eyes locked with his. Picture her. Now. On this ground. Her head bleeding. Her back broken from a hit she never saw coming. Her belongings dumped on the street like trash. Imagine her calling out for help, and no one listening. Imagine her walking with a cane, and someone snapping it in 2 just because they could. Do you see it? The man swallowed hard, but didn't speak. You can't, Marcus said with quiet disdain. Because if you could, you would have stopped. But you didn't. You did this with your eyes wide open. He stood and turned back to Alma. She still hadn't moved much, her breath shallow, her lips slightly parted. He knelt beside her, hands gentle. Mama, he whispered, reaching to brush the dried blood from her forehead with a handkerchief. She winced slightly. They got a good hit in, she murmured. Not the first, he said. Probably not the last. She closed her eyes for a moment. It hurt more that nobody stopped them. That's what stung. Marcus nodded slowly. It always does. He stood again and faced his men. Detain both. I want federal chains. Secure lock cuffs, no bruises, no excuses. One soldier approached each officer, neither resisting. Their eyes were blank now, stripped of authority, uniforms suddenly too heavy on their backs. The older one tried to argue under his breath, something about protocols, chain of command, internal investigations. Marcus didn't flinch. You touched a civilian without cause. You used force with no justification. You humiliated a woman who posed no threat, and you did it in public, with witnesses. There's no hiding now. He turned to the younger officer. You think tears are going to save you in court? When they show the footage, when they list every unnecessary contact, every word you said? The young man shook his head, face pale. I didn't know who she was. That's the problem, Marcus replied. You think respect is something people earn based on rank or bloodline. But she deserved your respect long before you ever laid eyes on her. And you failed. As the two men were secured and moved toward the waiting vehicle, Marcus approached a woman standing nearby, phone in hand. She had recorded everything silently. She didn't move when he came closer, but her eyes were nervous. Keep that video, he said. They'll try to twist the story. But truth needs witnesses. She nodded and whispered, thank you. He looked down at Alma again. Let's get you out of this heat. But Alma shook her head. Not yet. You don't need to. Yes, I do. She struggled to stand. Marcus reached down, supporting her weight carefully. She winced, but stood anyway, leaning slightly on him. They dragged me here in front of everyone, she said. I'm not leaving until they see me walk. Slowly, deliberately, Alma took a step forward. One foot, then the other. Her gait was shaky, but her spine stayed straight. Murmurs rose from the crowd. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet awe. People stepped back respectfully. The shame that had blanketed the bystanders now morphed into something else. Witnessing courage makes cowards feel small. A few people began filming again, but this time, it wasn't for clicks or likes. It was because what they were seeing deserved to be remembered. Alma made it to the passenger side of Marcus's vehicle, holding on to the handle as she turned to glance once more at the two officers, now cuffed, heads down. They won't remember my name, she said softly. But they'll remember what happened when they thought I had no one. Marcus nodded. They'll remember everything. He opened the door for her, helping her in. Home? He asked. She managed a tired smile. Tea. And my chair. He chuckled, closing the door gently before moving to the driver's side. As he sat down, the soldier in the passenger seat turned back. Sir, press wants a statement. Marcus didn't respond at first. He started the engine. Then, as he put the car into gear, he looked toward the crowd gathering behind the police tape. One reporter, microphone outstretched, caught his eye. General Jefferson, she called. Do you have anything to say to the public? He paused for a moment, then rolled the window down. Yeah, he said, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. If you think you can judge someone's worth based on the color of their skin, their age, or how much noise they make when they're in pain, think again. Because some of us are watching now. Some of us are done staying silent. And if you ever raise your hand to someone like my mother again, you'd better pray no one answers that call. He rolled the window back up and pulled away slowly. The crowd parted without a word. Behind them, the street looked the same. Same concrete. Same storefronts. But it had changed. Something had shifted. Because today, power learned it had limits. And silence learned it had a cost. The ride home was quiet. Alma rested her head back, eyes half closed. You always knew how to make an entrance, she whispered. Marcus smirked. You always taught me how. For a moment, neither said anything. Then she added, this isn't over. I know, he replied. But today we reminded them. You don't get to break people and walk away clean. She nodded, just once. Outside the window, the city moved on. Cars honked. People crossed streets. But Alma Jefferson, sitting in that front seat with dried blood on her dress and her dignity intact, wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a reckoning. And Marcus Jefferson, her son, wasn't just a general. He was what happens when justice doesn't knock. It kicks the door down. Marcus didn't speak for the rest of the ride. His eyes stayed on the road, hands steady on the wheel, jaw tight. Alma glanced at him occasionally, seeing something in his face that reminded her of the boy he once was, the one who clenched his fist when he saw injustice even at 6 years old, who once stood between her and a landlord yelling threats over late rent. That fire hadn't gone out. It had evolved. It had learned to wear a uniform. Alma's fingers rested gently on her lap, brushing against the fabric where her phone still hid. That call had been instinct, not strategy. But it changed everything. At a red light, Marcus finally spoke. They're going to try to spin this, he said. They'll pull department PR, union reps, internal reviews. Try to make it look like protocol. Alma didn't look at him. Let them try, she said. I got nothing left to be afraid of. He nodded slowly. I'll make sure this gets escalated. I won't let it get buried. Don't do it for me, she murmured. Do it so the next woman doesn't have to bleed to be believed. Marcus glanced at her. I'm doing it for both. They reached her home, a small, one-story house with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked when the wind blew too hard. He parked by the curb and came around to help her out. She refused his hand at first, then relented when her knee buckled slightly. Inside, she moved slowly, wincing as she lowered herself into her favorite chair. Marcus looked around, taking in the worn edges of the room he'd grown up in. The faded rug, the photos on the wall, the chipped mug on the side table. "Tea?" he asked. "Yes," she said, closing her eyes for a moment. In the kitchen, he moved like muscle memory. "Fill the kettle. Set the cups. Honey." She always liked honey. As the water boiled, he checked his phone. Notifications were exploding, media outlets, military command, even personal messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. A few texts asked, "Was that really your mom?" One message simply read, "They messed up." He locked the screen and went back to the living room. Alma had the news on. They were already replaying clips from the scene. Cell phone footage from multiple angles. Commentators speculating. Names starting to drop. "They're going to run this story until it burns out," Alma said, sipping tea as he handed her the cup. "But will they remember next week?" "They'll remember," Marcus said firmly. "Because I won't let them forget." That night, Marcus made calls. He spoke with attorneys. With journalists he trusted. With commanders who knew his record and respected his judgment. He wasn't just trying to make noise. He was building something: paper trails, sworn statements, public demand. The following morning, a press conference was called. He stood before a crowd of microphones outside a federal courthouse. His face was calm, but his voice was a blade. Yesterday, 2 officers assaulted a 77-year-old woman. They broke her cane. They slammed her into a patrol car. They humiliated her in public. Her crime? Walking home while black. That woman was my mother, but it could have been anyone's. And if I wasn't her son, if I wasn't a general, this might have ended with silence. But not this time. We are opening a formal investigation into use of excessive force, racially motivated misconduct, and abuse of power. There will be accountability. Not just because of who she is to me, but because of who she is to this country, a citizen. A human being. And we are done pretending this kind of behavior is rare. It is not rare. It is routine. And it ends now. Cameras clicked. Questions flew. He answered some. Ignored others. Focused only on the message. In the days that followed, protests erupted across cities. People carried signs with Alma's name. Others held images of her bruised face. She never asked for attention. Never wanted to be a symbol. But the world made her one. Reporters visited her porch, hoping for interviews. She declined most. But when she finally agreed to speak, it was for one purpose. "I don't need your pity," she said into the camera. "I need your help making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The footage of her simple words went viral. Not because of production value, but because they came from truth. Raw and unvarnished. Within a month, both officers were officially fired, pending criminal charges. Internal affairs reports confirmed excessive force. Community leaders called for retraining programs. Civil rights groups demanded legislation. And through it all, Alma stayed quiet, steady, sipping her tea, never pretending the pain was gone, only that it wouldn't be wasted. One evening, as Marcus visited after work, he found her on the porch. The swing creaked gently beneath her. He sat beside her, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. "You started a fire," he said. "No," she replied. "I just stopped pretending the house wasn't already burning." They sat in silence for a while. Then she added, "You know what I hate?" "What?" he asked. "That it had to be you. That it had to be your name. Your rank. Your uniform. For them to listen." Marcus looked down at his boots. "I know. You think it'll change?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Only if people who don't need to speak choose to." She nodded. "Then speak loud, son. Louder than they expect." That night, Marcus wrote an op-ed for a national paper. Not as a general. Not as a public figure. But as a son. In it, he wrote, "My mother didn't raise me to be feared. She raised me to be decent. But when decency isn't enough to protect her, I will use every ounce of the power I've earned to make sure no one forgets what she endured. Because the ones who stay quiet are the ones who let this keep happening. I won't be one of them." The piece was shared millions of times. Teachers read it aloud in classrooms. Activists used it as rallying cry. And somewhere in a precinct far away, 2 former officers sat behind bars, waiting for court dates, stripped of their badges, their confidence gone. Alma didn't celebrate. She didn't smile when she saw them cuffed on the news. She simply turned the TV off and stared out her window. Marcus asked her once, "Do you feel safer now?" She shook her head. "I don't need to feel safe. I need them to feel watched." He nodded. "They do." In the end, Alma never became a hashtag. She didn't want to be. She became something more. A reminder that no one is invisible. That the smallest voice, when heard by the right ears, can move entire institutions. That a cane can break, but resolve doesn't. And that sometimes, justice doesn't walk, it arrives like thunder. Marcus made sure of it. So did Alma. Together. Not as victims, but as reckoning. Quiet. Steady. And impossible to ignore. The headlines faded after a while, like they always do. The outrage cooled, the interviews stopped, and the world moved on to the next story, the next injustice, the next scandal that would shake people just long enough to post about it before forgetting. But in Alma's house, nothing faded. The bruises on her back didn't magically disappear when the cameras did. The crack in her cane hadn't healed. It stood by the front door still broken, a reminder that some wounds don't scar over quietly. Marcus came by often, not because she asked, but because he couldn't stay away. He'd sit across from her, watching her sip tea with both hands like the warmth helped hold her together. He watched her move slower than before, not because she was fragile, but because she had nothing left to rush toward. He'd ask her how she was feeling. She never lied. Tired. Angry. Not done yet, she'd say. And that was enough. The case went to trial 6 months later. By then, the public had stopped watching. The protests had thinned. But Marcus hadn't. He sat in the front row every day, military uniform pressed sharp, expression unreadable. When they showed the footage, the broken cane, the blood, the impact against the hood, the courtroom went silent. No sound except Alma's quiet breathing from the witness bench. When she testified, her voice didn't shake. She didn't cry. She told it plain. What they said. What they did. What they assumed. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. Because truth didn't need performance. The defense tried to argue confusion, mistaken identity, high tension, protocol under threat. But the jury didn't buy it. Maybe it was the footage. Maybe it was Alma's calm. Or maybe it was the look in Marcus's eyes every time they glanced his way, a look that said if justice wasn't served inside that room, something bigger would come for it outside. Both officers were convicted. Sentenced. One wept. The other didn't flinch. Alma didn't cheer. She didn't speak to reporters. When it was over, she simply stood, walked out of the courthouse with Marcus beside her, and went home. That night, she made dinner. Fried chicken. Collard greens. Cornbread. Just like she used to. Marcus sat at the table with the same appetite he had at 12. They'll write about this someday, he said between bites. Put your face in history books. She shook her head. Let them write whatever they want. I don't need a page. I needed a moment. You got it, he said. No, she corrected. We took it. The next morning, Alma went to the park near her house. She hadn't been there since the incident. It was quiet. Families with strollers. Teenagers with headphones. Joggers moving past her without a glance. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She sat on a bench near the fountain, watching a girl teach her younger brother how to tie his shoes. It was simple, peaceful, honest. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not peace. Just space. Breathing room. That night, she wrote a letter. Not to the officers. Not to the court. But to herself. She wrote about survival. About silence. About how long it takes to feel human again when people have tried to take that from you. She wrote about her son. How proud she was. How much it cost him to carry her pain. She folded the letter, placed it inside the broken cane, and left it by the door. Marcus didn't know about it. No one did. It wasn't for show. It was her way of closing a chapter. One that never should have been written, but was. Weeks passed. Then months. Marcus returned to duty. Promoted again. The military didn't try to quiet him. They couldn't. He gave speeches about power and restraint. He helped build a new training module for civilian interaction. It wasn't enough. He knew that. But it was something. One brick in a wall meant to protect instead of punish. Every time he visited Alma, she would ask, "Did you keep your promise?" And he would answer, "Every day." Eventually, the swing on her porch was replaced. The cane stayed broken. But Alma never walked with it again. She said it didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the moment it broke. And that moment had passed. One evening, years later, Alma sat with her great-granddaughter on her lap. The little girl asked, "Grandma, were you ever scared?" Alma looked down, brushed a curl from the girl's forehead, and said, "Only once. But I called someone who remembered who I was. And he came." The girl didn't understand. Not really. But someday she would. Someday someone would try to tell her that people like her were less. And she'd remember this story. Not because of the violence, but because of the response. Because of the roar that followed the silence. Because Alma Jefferson wasn't saved. She rose. And the world finally had to look up. That was the legacy. Not just survival, but proof that power doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears scars and patience. Sometimes it drinks tea and forgives slow. And sometimes it picks up the phone and reminds the world that it raised a warrior. Marcus would carry that with him forever. Not just as a soldier, but as a son. Because what happened on that street didn't just end with arrests or trials. It ended with a message so loud it didn't need to be shouted again. Never underestimate a woman with a son who never forgot who made him. Never think the quiet ones aren't listening. And never assume the broken won't rise. Not today. Not anymore. Not ever again. Years slipped by with a strange rhythm, not quite fast, not quite slow, just steady, like time had learned to walk at Alma's pace. She didn't become a public figure. She refused interviews, denied books, turned down documentary crews who came knocking with lights and promises of legacy. "I'm not your story," she'd say. "I'm just the proof that your story could have ended differently if someone had stood up." Marcus continued to rise through ranks, not chasing power but using it. His presence in briefings shifted the air, not because of medals, but because people had seen what happened when someone crossed the line with his mother. He became a silent line in every policy meeting. What if this touches someone like Alma again? That fear, that memory, it reshaped procedures, rewrote guidelines, made officers flinch before reaching too far. Change came like erosion, slow and uneven, but it came. Alma lived quietly. Her body bore the price of that day for years. Some mornings, she couldn't stand without help. Some nights, she'd wake with phantom pain in her ribs, her mind yanked back to the moment of impact against the hood. But she never let it stop her. She planted flowers, she wrote in her journals, she taught her great-granddaughter how to make biscuits from scratch. And every year, on the anniversary of that day, she would stand outside her house at noon, cane still broken, and hold it in the air for exactly 60 seconds. Neighbors would stop and watch, some not knowing why, others too young to remember. But she never explained. That moment belonged to her. Not to the cameras, not to the headlines, not to justice or vengeance. Just her. One year, Marcus visited and asked her what she thought people remembered most. She didn't hesitate. "Not my pain," she said. "They remember your boots." He smiled, understanding the weight behind that answer. "You know," he said, "I didn't come in that truck because I was a general. I came because I was your boy." She leaned over and touched his hand. That's why it mattered. Eventually, Alma's health faded. Age doesn't negotiate, even with the strong. When she passed, it wasn't with ceremony. She died in her sleep, quiet and peaceful, a faint smile on her lips, as if she knew something no one else did. Marcus was there. He held her hand long after the warmth left it. He didn't cry. Not then. He sat beside her for hours, remembering everything. The way she stood back up that day. The way her voice didn't shake in court. The way she refused to be pitted. And the way she raised a man who could walk into a war zone without flinching but still kneel beside his mother with tears just behind his eyes. Her funeral was small by choice. No cameras. No press. Just family. Community. People who knew her not as a headline, but as a force of nature. Marcus gave a short eulogy. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. But she changed more lives than she'll ever know. And she did it all with a voice most people never heard until it was too late to ignore. "My mother didn't just raise me. She taught me how to rise." After the funeral, he returned to her house. Sat in her chair. Looked out her window. Then he walked to the front door, opened the closet, and pulled out the broken cane. It still had the letter inside. He hadn't read it until then. Carefully, he unfolded the paper, her handwriting still strong, steady, filled with the same fire that never left her eyes. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. But you're not. You're still here. So speak. Fight. Protect. And love. Because one day, someone will need you to show up like you did for me. And when that moment comes, don't hesitate. Make them remember. Not for revenge. For reckoning. For dignity. For us." He folded it again, placed it in his pocket, and stood in the same spot she once stood every year at noon. He raised the cane into the sky, held it high as the sun poured over him. People stopped, recognizing the moment. Some raised their fists. Some simply bowed their heads. And for 60 seconds, the world was quiet. Not silent out of fear, but quiet in respect. Because they remembered. They always would. Not because she asked them to, but because when they looked at her, they saw something rare. A woman who never wanted to be the center of attention, but became the center of change. Alma Jefferson didn't just endure. She transformed. She took the worst of the system and made it look itself in the mirror. She made power kneel. And now, long after her heartbeat had stopped, her story still moved. In classrooms where students studied civil rights. In courtrooms where policies had shifted. In precincts where her name was part of mandatory ethics training. And in the hearts of anyone who ever thought they were alone. Because when Alma was pushed down, she stood up taller than anyone expected. And when she spoke, the world didn't just listen, it obeyed. Her name didn't need a monument. It had memory. It had echo. And it had a son who would never let it die. Marcus turned away from the street, entered the house, and closed the door behind him, not with finality, but with promise. Because the story didn't end there. It continued in every act of resistance, every moment of dignity, and every quiet voice refusing to be silenced. This was never just about justice. It was about never letting the world forget what happens when you mistake silence for surrender. And Alma Jefferson never surrendered. Not once. Not ever. And that was the story of Alma Jefferson, a woman they thought was invisible, until she reminded the world that quiet strength is still strength. That dignity, once torn, can rise louder than any badge, any uniform, any lie told in daylight. She didn't ask to be a symbol, but her courage demanded to be remembered. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something real, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Let someone else remember Alma, too. Because stories like this deserve more than just silence. And if you want more true stories that cut through the noise, that shine a light on what the world tries to hide, this is what we do. Subscribe to Cracks of Light, hit the like button if this story stayed with you, and drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and what part of Alma's story you'll never forget. Until next time, stay awake, stay loud, and never forget. The smallest light can break through the darkest moment.